A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello, this is David McKnight. Welcome to the Power of Zero podcast. Good to have you back. Today, we're going to spend about 10 minutes talking about the taxable bucket. So for those of you who have read my book, The Power of Zero, I wrote a whole chapter on the taxable bucket. You also know that there are three different types of accounts within which you can grow your money, one of which is the taxable bucket, and that's usually the one I like to talk about first. What is the taxable bucket? Well, the taxable bucket contains investments where every year as those investments grow, you get to pay a tax. What are we talking about here? We're talking about savings accounts. We're talking about checking accounts. We're talking about money markets, CDs, stocks, bonds, mutual funds. How can you tell if those investments are actually taxable? Well, every year you get that little love letter from the IRS. It's called a 1099. It says, hey, your money grew this much. Now you got to give a portion of that growth back to the IRS in the form of a tax bill. Okay. So these are not the most efficient investments in the world. I tell people all the time, hey, you can have as much money as you want in your taxable bucket as long as you recognize that there is a financial consequence for doing so. You see, these are the least efficient of all investments because you got to pay that tax each and every year on that investment as it grows. And it doesn't seem like a big deal to have too much money in that bucket. But if you take those financial inefficiencies and you amortize those out over a lifetime, it could cost you a couple $100,000. So it's really important that we identify the ideal balance in the taxable bucket. So this is really the one thing that financial experts can really agree upon. The ideal balance in your taxable bucket is going to depend on, number one, your marital status. It's going to depend on whether you have both spouses working or not. It may even depend on whether you're a business owner or not. So, for example, here's a good rule of thumb to live by. If you have two steady incomes in your family, then you're going to want to have at least 3 months worth of bare bones living expenses. Now, when we're talking living expenses, we're not talking about what you're putting into your 401k. We're not talking about taxes. We're not talking about how much money you would spend on vacation, because what we're talking about is bare bones living expenses. If you were to have some sort of financial trauma in your life, unemployment, sickness, what have you, you're not going to be contributing to your 401k anymore. You're not going to be going on vacations, and you're not going to be paying taxes on that income that you're no longer earning. So when we say bare bones, minimal expenses, we're talking about just enough to sustain your life and to pay those bills that you can't otherwise get out of, to pay for your food, to keep the lights on, to keep yourself from getting kicked out of your house. These are the types of things we're talking about. Now, if you've got one income earner in your household, and or you are a business owner, then you're going to want to have closer to 6 months worth of bare bones living expenses, because at least if you had two incomes going on in your house, one person gets laid off, that other person's income can still buoy you up, and you're not going to need as much. But if you have only one income earner in your home, you're going to want to stand by that 6-month rule. Very, very important. All right, so we talked about the ideal amount in the taxable bucket. Okay, these are your least valuable dollars. How can you tell they're your least valuable dollars? Well, one way of doing it, if you really want to peer into the brain of the IRS, this is how you do it. Take a look at the contribution limits that they define for each of these different types of buckets we're talking about. And I'll do a brief review. For example, with your Roth IRA and your tax-free bucket, we'll do a whole episode on tax-free a little bit later on. You can only put, if you're older than 50 years old, you can only put $6,500 in your Roth IRA. You know what that tells me? There's something good about the Roth IRA. There's something compelling about that account. If the IRS is only going to allow me to put in $6,500 per year in there, there's something good about that account. Take a look at the tax deferred bucket. You can put in $24,500 into your Roth IRA, your Roth 401k, or your traditional 401k. What does that tell you? There's something good about that bucket, but not quite as good as tax-free. And then now let's take a look at the taxable bucket. Let me ask you a question. If you won the Powerball lottery, would the IRS be okay if you stuck every last dime of those winnings into your taxable bucket? And the answer is yeah. There is no limit on how much money you can put into your taxable bucket. And that's why we say you've got to be contributing to this bucket in very defined and finite amounts of ways, because this is really where the IRS wants you to keep most of your money, because that's where they make the most. Every single year when your money grows, you get to pay a tax. Okay. And if it's an investment that you've held longer than a year, you're going to pay long-term capital gains. If it's shorter than a year, you're going to pay short-term capital gains. Either way, you're going to pay a tax. So we want to define in a very limited way the amount of money that we want to have in this bucket. And like I said before, if you want to have more than 6 months worth of basic living expenses in there, you can, as long as you recognize that there's a financial consequence for doing so. And the other thing that we also have to recognize, and we talked about this in the first episode, is there is in a rising tax rate environment, we really want to have a finite amount of money in our taxable and tax deferred buckets. Because remember, let's just take a look at the taxable bucket. If your bucket grows every year, your 1099 or your tax bill is likewise going to grow. That's the first part. The second part is, if we're in a rising tax rate environment, every time tax rates go up, the taxes that you're going to pay on that ever increasing balance in that taxable bucket is likewise going to grow. That's what we call the double compounding problem. So you can get to the point where over the course of 10 years, if your balance grew by just 1% per year and taxes went up by 1% per year, you could get to the point where you're really, really almost doubling your taxes in that bucket. So we've got to be very, very cognizant of how much money we have in that bucket and recognize that it has a purpose. It's to primarily meet the needs of an emergency fund. Now, you might say, okay, I'm saving for a wedding. I'm okay if you can save that money in that type of account. I'm saving for a house down payment. Those are the types of things that you want to do in the taxable bucket. But what you don't want to do is you want to say, hey, look, I'm nervous about life. I'm nervous about where the world's heading. I want to have 5 years worth of basic living expenses in that bucket. You can certainly do that as long as you recognize that you are paying a tax that is otherwise an avoidable tax. So there's taxes in life that we pay that we aren't required to pay. And my job is to try to help you understand how to give as little to the IRS as you possibly can. Now, there's other financial consequences of having too much money in your taxable bucket. You got to remember that any 1099s that get generated out of your taxable bucket count as provisional income. What is provisional income? We talked about this, I believe, in the first podcast episode. Provisional income is the income that the IRS keeps track of to determine if they're going to tax your Social Security. I give you an example. I had a while back, I had a couple walk into my office. They lived through the Depression. They said, Dave, we've got 9 CDs for $100,000 each in 9 different banks, of course, sitting in their taxable bucket. And they said, we think we may be paying too much in tax. I said, you are paying too much in tax. Not only that, but you are unwittingly causing your Social Security to be taxed. Therefore, it's not just the tax that you're paying each and every year. It's the fact that you could lose up to 1/3 of your Social Security due to having too much money in your taxable bucket. So here are the thresholds you gotta really worry about. If you are single, if you have more than $34,000 in your tax of provisional income, including 1099s coming out of your taxable bucket. Also, any distributions from your tax deferred bucket, we'll talk about that later, also count as provisional income. 1/2 of your Social Security also counts as provisional income. When you add all of these different sources of provisional income up, and if as a single person it adds up to more than $34,000, or if as a married couple it adds up to more than $44,000, then up to 85% of your Social Security can become taxable to you at your highest marginal tax bracket. So remember, there are unintended consequences associated with having too much money in your taxable bucket. So this, of course, begs the question, what if I do have too much money in my taxable bucket? Or what if I've got so much money to save, I'm maxing out my 401k, or I'm maxing out my Roth 401k, I'm maxing out my Roth IRAs. Where can we, how can we spend this money down? Well, I just mentioned one of them. First of all, you can either redirect those surplus contributions, or if your balance is higher than 6 months worth of basic living expenses, you can redirect or do what we call an asset shift and shift that money systematically to tax-free. You can do that by way of a Roth IRA. That's one way that you can do it. If you max out your Roth IRA and you still have money left over, you can do what's called a life insurance retirement plan. We'll do a whole episode on the life insurance retirement plan. Basically, a life insurance retirement plan is the opposite of what most people do when it comes to life insurance. Most people get as much death benefit as they can for as little money as possible. We're talking about getting as little life insurance as the IRS requires of you, and stuff as much money into it as the IRS allows. That's one way. There's no limit on how much you put into these types of accounts. So if you've got massive balances in your taxable bucket, this is a great way to start to spend that down and get it to the right amount. Now, there's other ways to spend this bucket down. One strategy is if you plan on doing a Roth conversion and you've got too much money in your taxable bucket, you almost certainly don't want to pay your taxes out of the conversion itself. In other words, you don't want the IRS to withhold the tax from the conversion itself. In other words, pay the tax out of the shift that you're making from tax deferred to tax free. Because remember, there's only so much money you can get into the tax free bucket. And if you're shifting, say, $50,000 per year into your Roth IRA, you want every last dime of that $50,000 to make it into the tax free bucket. One way to ensure that is to simply pay your tax out of your taxable bucket. In other words, take a distribution from your taxable bucket, use that to pay the taxes on a Roth conversion. Now, keep in mind that if you do a Roth conversion pre-59.5, the only way you can really pay those taxes is if you have a bunch of money sitting around in your taxable bucket that you would be willing to earmark for the tax on that Roth conversion. If you try to pay the tax on that Roth conversion out of the Roth conversion itself, pre-59.5, you'll get a penalty because you're not yet 59.5 yet. So it's a penalty for early withdrawal. Now, there's one other outside the box way of spending down a taxable balance, a taxable bucket balance that's too high. And it's this. Let's say you got $1 million in your taxable bucket, or even 500,000, far more than what would be required for a 6-month, a 6-month shield against some financial emergency. And there's no way you can really spend all that money down to the right amount, at least not quickly anyway. Well, what you could do is you could say, okay, I am going to max out, say, my Roth 401k. Did you know you can put $24,500 into your Roth 401k? If your spouse has a Roth 401k, he or she can do it as well. So that's almost $50,000 you can put into a Roth 401k each and every year. Well, you may be saying, well, there's no way I could put $50,000 into my Roth 401ks each and every year, almost $50,000. To which I respond, well, if you've got $500,000 to $1 million languishing in your taxable bucket, why not have your company withhold the full $24,500 that you're allowed to put into your Roth 401k for you and $24,500 for your spouse? Have them withhold that from your paycheck. And now you're thinking, okay, well, if they withhold it from my paycheck, how am I supposed to live? Well, guess what? If you can have them withhold that from your paycheck, then you can actually pay for your lifestyle expenses out of your taxable bucket. And that would enable you to spend the balance of that taxable bucket down to a much more appropriate amount. And then it's going to make sure that not a year goes by where you're not taking advantage of all of the tax-free investments that the IRS makes available to you. So there's no excuse, really, if you have a balance in the taxable bucket that's too high, because there's so many different options to be able to get it down to the ideal amount. We can fund Roth IRAs. We can fund Roth 401ks. We can use the money in that bucket to pay the taxes on conversion. We can live out of that bucket and have our companies withhold a greater portion of our paycheck to go towards Roth 401k type stories. So what's What's the idea? What's the moral of the story when it comes to the taxable bucket? You can have too much money in there from a tax efficiency perspective. You can have not enough from an emergency fund perspective. So what we're looking for is just the right amount. What is just the right amount? If you're got one breadwinner in your home, it's about 6 months worth of basic living expenses. Or if you're a business owner, I would say at least that much. Or if you're married and you got two breadwinners in the household, then 3 months will probably do it. But just remember, there's a perfect amount to have in that taxable bucket. And there's lots of ways to get money out of there if you don't want to continue to pay those unnecessary taxes over time. Anyway, thanks for being with us on the Power of Zero show today. We will look forward to talking to you in episode 3. Thanks for being with us.